A tiny grizzly cub, alone and helpless, was struggling to stay afloat in the freezing, icy waters of a remote swamp. The current was too strong, the cold was unbearable. Its tiny paws clawed at the surface, but it was sinking. No one was there to help. No one even knew it was out there, except for one man. A hiker who had set out that morning unaware that he was about to walk into a life-or-death moment that would change him forever. As he approached the swamp, he heard it, a sound so faint, so fragile that he almost mistook it for the wind. Then he saw it, a tiny bear cub gasping for air, its eyes wide with fear, moments away from vanishing beneath the ice. What happened next? No one was prepared for it. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel, like this video, and turn on notifications. Your support helps bring more powerful and inspiring stories like this to life. The air was cold enough to bite at Daniel Carter's skin, even through his thick jacket. The late autumn wind carried a crisp scent of pine and damp earth, mingled with the faint metallic sharpness of the season's first frost. He had been hiking since sunrise, following an isolated trail deep in the Alaskan wilderness, the kind of place where the silence was so profound it pressed against his ears. For years, Daniel had sought out places like this, remote, untouched places where the rest of the world faded away. Out here, he wasn't just another man caught in the noise of civilization. He was part of something greater, something raw and real. But today, something felt off. He paused mid-step, adjusting the straps of his backpack as his breath curled in the air before him. It was too quiet. No birds rustling in the trees. No distant crackle of a squirrel darting through fallen leaves. No sounds at all. Then, a noise. Faint. Weak. Almost swallowed by the wind. Daniel's heartbeat quickened. He turned his head, straining to listen. The sound came again, distant but unmistakable, a whimper. His grip on his hiking pole tightened. He had spent enough time in the wilderness to recognize distress when he heard it. This wasn't the wind. It wasn't just some branch creaking under the weight of the frost. Something was out there, and it was in trouble. He stepped off the trail, his boots crunching against the frozen ground as he moved toward the sound. The dense thicket of evergreens made it hard to see, the undergrowth tangling around his legs as he pushed through. His heart pounded harder with every step. The sound grew louder. Then, through the trees, he spotted a break in the landscape, a small clearing leading to the edge of a swamp. Daniel stopped short. The water was dark, partially frozen, with jagged patches of ice floating on the surface. It stretched across the clearing like a trap waiting to snap shut. And there, struggling in the middle of it, was a tiny grizzly bear cub. His breath caught. The cub was barely older than a few months, its fur dark and drenched, slick against its frail body. It was thrashing, its small paws clawing desperately at the icy water, trying to find something solid, something to hold on to. But there was nothing. No mother. No other bears. Just this helpless creature, drowning. Daniel's stomach twisted. The cub's movements were frantic but weak. It had probably been fighting for its life for minutes, maybe longer. The cold was already sapping its strength. Daniel had read about this. Hypothermia in freezing water set in fast. First, the muscles locked up. Then, the body lost the ability to keep itself afloat. Then, it sank. His pulse hammered in his ears. The cub was running out of time. His instincts screamed at him to do something. But this wasn't just any animal. It was a grizzly cub, and that meant its mother had to be nearby. Daniel scanned the tree line, his breath tight in his chest. Nothing. No movement. No deep growl of warning. No shadow shifting between the trees. Just silence. Which meant the cub was completely alone. He didn't have time to think about how it had ended up there. Maybe it had wandered too far from its den. Maybe it had tried to cross the swamp, slipping through a weak spot in the ice. Maybe its mother had left it behind, forced to abandon it in the brutal survival laws of the wild. None of it mattered now. What mattered was that the cub was going to die if he didn't act. His mind raced. He dropped his pack and rushed to the edge of the water, kneeling in the cold mud. He needed a plan. If he moved too fast, the ice might break beneath him. If he got careless, he could end up in the water himself. And out here, miles from help, a mistake like that wouldn't just be dangerous, it would be deadly. He scanned the area, searching for anything he could use. A fallen tree. A long branch. His eyes landed on a thick, sturdy limb, half buried in the undergrowth nearby. Perfect. He yanked it free and inched closer to the ice. The cub let out a strangled whimper, its head bobbing beneath the surface before it resurfaced, barely above water. Daniel's chest clenched. He extended the branch. Come on, little one. Grab on. The cub flailed, but its paws barely touched the wood. It was too weak. Daniel gritted his teeth. He was running out of options. The cub coughed, sputtering as its head slipped under again. His entire body tensed. He didn't have a choice. His boots crunched against the ice as he stepped onto the frozen surface. The cold bit through his clothes instantly, the frost-covered ground beneath him groaning under his weight. One step. Then another. A deep, splintering crack echoed beneath him. He froze. The ice was weaker than he had hoped. Any more weight and he was going in with the cub, but he wasn't stopping now. He dropped to his stomach, spreading out his weight. The ice creaked but didn't give. He inched forward, reaching as far as he could. The cub's head dipped under again. Daniel lunged. His fingers closed around the cub's wet fur. The moment he made contact, the ice beneath him let out a final deafening crack. For one terrifying second, he felt himself slipping. The ice was giving way. He didn't have time to think. With every ounce of strength he had left, he pulled. The cub's small body slid out of the water, coughing, gasping, shivering uncontrollably. But now Daniel had another problem. He was still lying on ice that was about to break, and if he didn't move fast, he was going in next. Daniel didn't move. He could feel it beneath him, the ice wasn't just cracking, it was breaking. A deep, splintering sound echoed in his ears, a warning from nature itself. The fragile surface beneath his chest had already given way in some spots, the frigid water creeping up through the cracks, soaking into his sleeves. But he couldn't think about that. Not yet. The tiny grizzly cub was lying motionless on the ice beside him, its body shivering violently, its soaked fur clinging to its small frame. The icy water had stolen its warmth, its strength. It wasn't out of danger yet, and neither was he. The cub coughed, its tiny body jerking with each weak breath. The sound was faint, too faint. Daniel clenched his jaw. He had no idea how long it had been in the water, but if hypothermia had already set in, its little body wouldn't be able to generate heat on its own. They had minutes, maybe less. He glanced toward the edge of the swamp. It wasn't far, maybe 10 feet, but those 10 feet were nothing but unstable ice, thinning toward the shore. And he was lying right in the center of it. His breath came in short bursts, misting in the freezing air as he calculated his next move. He couldn't stand. If he put too much weight in one spot, the entire sheet would collapse. The only way was slow, controlled. Daniel adjusted his grip on the cub, shifting its small body closer to his chest, feeling the tremors of its cold-ridden body against his own. Its breathing was still shallow, its paws barely twitched. He didn't have time to wait. Keeping his entire body as flat as possible, he inched backward, pushing against the ice with his elbows. The movement was slow, painfully slow. Every shift of weight sent fresh splintering cracks across the surface, echoing like gunfire in the silence. One foot, then another. The shore was getting closer. Daniel could hear the soft lapping of water against the frozen edges, the wind howling through the trees. His muscles ached from the strain, his fingers numb from the freezing cold, but he didn't stop. Then, a snap. A section of ice near his left arm collapsed into the water. The shift sent his body tilting sideways, the weight of his pack dragging him dangerously close to the hole. For one horrifying second, his fingers scrabbled against the ice, his breath catching in his throat. Then he stopped moving. His heart hammered against his ribs. The cub let out a weak whimper, barely audible over the wind. Daniel forced himself to breathe, to stay calm. The shore was just 5 feet away. He could make it. He had to. He adjusted his grip on the cub, shifting its weight higher against his chest. Then, with deliberate movements, he pushed forward another foot. The ice groaned beneath him, but it held. 3 feet left. Daniel's elbows burned from the friction against the frozen surface, but he ignored it, gritting his teeth as he made the final push. Then, his hand touched solid ground. A flood of relief crashed over him. With one last effort, he hauled himself up onto the frozen dirt, his body rolling onto its side, gasping for breath. The cub was still in his arms, shivering uncontrollably, but its breaths were coming faster now. They had made it. But they weren't safe yet. Daniel knew the worst part of hypothermia wasn't just surviving the cold, it was what happened afterward. If the cub's body temperature had dropped too much, its organs could start shutting down. He had to get it warm fast. Pushing himself up, he stumbled to his backpack, yanking it open with trembling hands. A dry flannel shirt. A survival blanket. A spare wool beanie. It wasn't much, but it would have to do. He dropped to his knees beside the cub, wrapping it tightly in the flannel before enclosing both of them in the reflective blanket. The cub didn't resist. It was too weak to fight. Daniel held it against his chest, rubbing its fur, trying to transfer any warmth he could. His breathing was still heavy, his pulse still racing, but he knew the fight wasn't over. They were alone in the wilderness, miles from help. And if he didn't figure out his next move fast, saving the cub from the swamp wouldn't matter, because they wouldn't survive the night. Daniel could still feel the ice-cold burn on his arms, his sleeves damp from where the water had seeped through. The cold wasn't just in the air anymore. It was in his bones, clawing at him, trying to take hold. But he wasn't the one in immediate danger. The cub lay limp in his arms, its tiny body wrapped in his flannel shirt, enclosed within the emergency blanket. Its breathing was shallow, its small chest barely rising and falling. Daniel pressed his hand gently against the cub's ribs. It was still too cold, way too cold. The flannel and blanket weren't enough. He needed real warmth. Daniel sat back on his heels, scanning his surroundings. The swamp was behind him now, its jagged ice reflecting the dim afternoon light like shards of broken glass. The ground around him was damp, a mixture of frozen mud and patches of dead grass. No shelter. No cover. His tent was still in his pack, but setting it up would take time. And time was the one thing they didn't have. The temperature was dropping fast. The cub wasn't moving. Daniel clenched his jaw. He had to act now. He pulled off his backpack, digging through the main compartment. His fingers were stiff from the cold, fumbling over zippers and straps as he pulled out his fire starter kit, flint, steel, some dry tinder. It wasn't much, but it would do. He turned his attention to the nearby trees, scanning the undergrowth for anything dry enough to burn. The dampness of the swamp had soaked much of the area, but he spotted some dead branches beneath a thick pine tree, their brittle bark protected from the elements. He moved quickly, breaking them into smaller pieces and arranging them into a pile in a small clearing where the ground was drier. His hands worked on instinct. He had built 100 fires before, but never with this much at stake. The flint sparked on the second strike. The tinder caught. Within minutes, a small fire crackled to life, its flames licking upward, pushing back the cold. Daniel wasted no time. He sat down near the flames, pulling the cub closer, wrapping the blanket around them both. The cub's tiny body trembled, its fur still damp, but at least it was reacting. Daniel reached into his pack again, pulling out a bottle of water. He poured a few drops into the cap and carefully tilted it toward the cub's mouth. "Come on, little guy," he murmured. "Just a sip." The cub didn't move at first. Then, a faint twitch. Its tongue flicked against the water, a small, weak swallow. Daniel exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. It was a start, but he knew they weren't out of the woods yet. The cub was still in critical condition. Hypothermia wasn't just about getting warm, it was about staying warm. If its core temperature dropped again, it might not recover. He tightened the blanket, adjusting the cub's position so that it was pressed against his chest. The fire's warmth seeped into his skin, bringing some life back into his frozen fingers. He looked up at the sky. The sun was sinking lower. Daniel's stomach twisted. Nightfall was coming fast. The last thing he wanted was to spend the night this deep in the wilderness with an injured animal, but he had no choice. Traveling in the dark was too risky. The cold would be even worse. And there was still one terrifying question gnawing at the back of his mind. Where was the mother? Daniel glanced toward the trees, his gut tightening. Grizzly cubs didn't just wander off alone. Something had happened. Either the mother was injured or dead, or worse, she was out there searching. His fingers instinctively tightened around the cub. If she came back now and saw her cub in his arms. He didn't want to think about what would happen. Daniel sighed, shaking off the thought. One problem at a time. Right now, the focus was survival. They needed to make it through the night. Only then could he figure out what to do next. And he prayed that by morning, the cub would still be breathing. The fire crackled, its warm glow flickering against the approaching darkness. The small flames danced in contrast to the bitter cold that crept through the forest, wrapping around the clearing like an unseen predator. Daniel adjusted the emergency blanket around the cub, pressing it closer to his chest. The little bear was still trembling, but at least it was breathing. Slow, weak, but steady. That had to be enough. He glanced up at the sky. The last remnants of daylight had faded into a deep, starless black. The temperature was dropping fast. Daniel had been in the wilderness before. He knew what that meant. It wasn't just the cold he had to worry about, it was everything else. His eyes flickered toward the tree line. The dense forest stretched endlessly in all directions, its depths impenetrable in the dark. Something was out there. He could feel it. The back of his neck prickled with the unmistakable sensation of being watched. He wasn't alone. And then, a sound. Low. Distant. A deep, guttural growl. Daniel's pulse spiked. He instinctively pulled the cub closer, his breath catching in his throat as he strained to listen. The growl didn't come again. But that didn't mean whoever, or whatever, was out there had left. His mind raced through the possibilities. Coyotes wouldn't be a threat. Wolves might. But the one thing that truly sent fear coursing through his veins was the thought of her. The mother grizzly. Was she still alive? Was she looking for her cub? Would she follow its scent here? Daniel clenched his jaw, trying to steady his breathing. If she found him with her cub in his arms, there wouldn't be time to explain. There wouldn't be time for anything. He reached for his knife, sliding it from the sheath at his waist. It was a poor defense against a full-grown bear, but it was better than nothing. The cub shifted slightly in his arms, letting out a faint whimper. Daniel looked down. The little bear's breathing was heavier now, but its body was warmer than before. That was a good sign. He gently pressed his palm against its tiny ribs, feeling the slow but consistent rise and fall. It was alive. Now, he just had to make sure they both stayed that way. The fire crackled again, spitting embers into the cold night air. Daniel turned back to his pack, quickly pulling out the few supplies he had left, some protein bars, a half-empty canteen, and a small flashlight. He couldn't afford to waste anything. He needed every ounce of energy for the morning. Because once the sun rose, he had a decision to make. Did he keep moving towards civilization, hoping to find help before the cub deteriorated again? Or did he go back the way he came, trying to find out what had happened to the mother? Neither option was safe. But one thing was certain, if he made the wrong choice, it wouldn't just be the cub's life on the line. He glanced back toward the trees. The silence felt heavier now, pressing against his skin like a warning. Something was waiting. Daniel just didn't know what. And by morning, he wasn't sure if he wanted to find out. The night dragged on, the fire slowly dying into a bed of glowing embers. Daniel barely slept. Every time his eyes closed, a noise in the distance sent a fresh jolt of adrenaline through his body. The wind rustling through the trees. The snap of a branch. The eerie silence that would stretch for minutes at a time. But the worst part? The waiting. Waiting to see if the cub would survive until morning. Waiting to see if its mother would appear from the darkness, searching, ready to fight for what was hers. Daniel tightened his grip on the cub, feeling the steady, rhythmic rise and fall of its tiny chest. The warmth of the fire and the insulation of the blanket had helped. It was no longer shivering uncontrollably. That was a good sign. But the cub was still weak. Too weak. If Daniel didn't find help soon, everything he had done, risking his life on the ice, fighting through exhaustion, staying up all night to keep them both warm, would have been for nothing. He exhaled, pressing a hand over his face. He needed to decide. There were two options. Option 1, keep moving towards civilization, following the trails that would eventually lead him to a ranger station or an outpost. It would be dangerous, with rough terrain, unpredictable weather, and no guarantee that the cub could survive the trip. Option 2, go back, back toward the swamp, back toward the place where he had found the cub, back toward whatever had happened to its mother. Daniel felt a knot tighten in his stomach. He didn't like either choice. The risk of traveling with an injured animal in these conditions was enormous. But if he returned to the swamp, there was a chance he'd find something useful, tracks, clues, maybe even the mother herself. Or her body. His gut twisted at the thought. If she was dead, that meant something had killed her. And if she wasn't dead, then she was out there, looking for her cub. The wind howled through the trees, sending a fresh chill across Daniel's skin. He pulled the cub closer, feeling the slow, sleepy weight of it against his chest. It was resting now, but for how long? He sighed, staring into the remnants of the fire, watching the embers flicker and fade. There was no perfect answer, no easy way forward. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized there was only one choice. If he wanted to understand what had happened, if he wanted to find out why this cub had ended up alone, he had to go back. Back to the beginning. Back to the swamp. Back to whatever was waiting for him in the woods. And he had no idea if he was walking into the truth or into something far worse. The morning air was crisp, the kind of cold that seeped into your bones, making every movement feel heavier. Daniel shifted the small bear cub in his arms, adjusting the blanket around its fragile body before slinging his pack over his shoulder. The fire had burned out hours ago, leaving behind nothing but gray ash and a circle of damp earth. He kicked dirt over the remains, ensuring no embers remained, then turned toward the path leading back to the swamp. This was the moment of no return. His decision had been made. He wasn't heading toward safety. He was heading toward the unknown. Each step through the thick undergrowth felt heavier than the last, the weight of exhaustion tugging at his limbs, but he forced himself to keep moving. The cub stirred in his arms, letting out a soft whimper. It was getting stronger. That should have been a relief, but it wasn't. A stronger cub meant louder cries, more movement, more risk. If the mother was still out there, she would hear it. And if something else had taken her place? Daniel clenched his jaw, pushing the thought away. He needed to focus on what was in front of him, not what might be lurking in the shadows. By the time he reached the edge of the swamp, the sun had climbed high enough to cast long golden streaks across the icy water. The surface looked peaceful now, the jagged ice floating calmly in the morning light. But Daniel knew better. This place wasn't peaceful. It was where something had gone horribly wrong. He moved carefully, scanning the ground for any signs of what had happened here, tracks, blood, anything that could explain why the cub had ended up alone. And then he found it. A massive disturbance in the mud, not far from where he had pulled the cub from the water. Something had struggled here. The ground was torn apart, deep claw marks gouging through the wet earth. Daniel swallowed hard. He had seen bear tracks before. But these weren't just the marks of a bear walking. These were the marks of a fight. His heart pounded as he followed the signs, his boots sinking slightly in the damp ground. The cub shifted in his arms, but he barely noticed. His focus was locked on what lay ahead. And then he saw it. Blood. Not a lot, but enough. A dark stain against the frost-covered earth, smeared across the mud, leading toward the dense forest beyond the swamp. Something had happened here. Something violent. Daniel's breath came in slow, measured inhales. He knelt, examining the marks more closely. 2 sets of tracks. One big. One even bigger. His stomach clenched. Bears didn't just vanish. If the mother bear was gone, it meant one of two things. She had run. Or she had been forced to leave. His fingers tightened around the cub instinctively. If there had been another bear here, a larger one, a male, a threat. His eyes flicked toward the dark tree line ahead. Was it still out there? Watching? Waiting? The cub let out another soft whimper, its tiny body stirring against Daniel's chest. The sound felt too loud. Too exposed. Daniel stood quickly, his body tense. He needed to move. Now. Because suddenly, he wasn't just looking at the aftermath of something violent. He was standing in the middle of it. And whatever had happened here might not be over yet. Daniel's grip on the cub tightened as the cold air pressed against his skin. The signs of struggle were clear, the torn-up earth, the deep claw marks, the smear of blood leading into the trees. Something had happened here. And whatever it was, it hadn't happened long ago. The forest felt different now. More alive. More dangerous. He could hear his own breath, steady but tense. The cub shifted again in his arms, its tiny body warmer than before, a sign that it was recovering. But the small grizzly let out another soft whimper. And Daniel instinctively held it close, his eyes scanning the tree line. That noise was a risk. If the mother bear was out there, she would hear it. If something else was out there, it would hear it too. Daniel turned slowly, his muscles tight with the instinctive urge to run. But he didn't. Running wasn't an option. Then, a sound. Not the wind. Not the rustling of trees. Something heavy moving. Daniel's pulse spiked. Then he saw it, a shape emerging from the trees. His breath caught. It was a bear. But not just any bear. The mother. She was massive, her thick coat dusted with dirt. Her eyes locked onto Daniel in a way that made his stomach turn. Her breathing was heavy, her body tense. She wasn't running toward him. She wasn't growling. But she was staring. Daniel knew he had seconds to react. The cub in his arms let out another faint cry. And in that instant, everything changed. The mother bear stepped forward. Slow. Deliberate. Her ears weren't pinned back. She wasn't showing her teeth. But Daniel knew better than to assume he was safe. He didn't move. Didn't blink. Didn't breathe. The mother bear's massive head lowered slightly, nostrils flaring as she sniffed the air between them. She knew. She knew her cub was in his arms. Daniel's fingers curled tighter around the small body, every nerve in his body screaming at him to be careful. Then, for the first time, he noticed something. She was limping. Her front leg had deep scratches, fresh wounds that were still dark with dried blood. She had been in a fight. Daniel's chest tightened. She hadn't abandoned her cub. She had been forced away. A bear, likely a male, bigger, stronger, had attacked her, driven her off. And now, she was here, facing him, staring at her baby in the arms of a human. Daniel's heartbeat roared in his ears. This moment, this single moment, was everything. If she lunged, if she decided he was a threat, he wouldn't have time to react. But she didn't. She stepped forward again. Close now. Close enough that Daniel could see every detail of her massive frame, the scars, the damp fur, the deep brown of her eyes. Then, she let out a low, heavy breath. Not a growl. Not a warning. Something else. Daniel didn't fully understand it, but he knew what he had to do. Slowly. Painfully slowly. He crouched down, his arms trembling as he unwrapped the cub from the blanket. The tiny bear gave a soft, weak cry, and the mother bear reacted. Her body tensed, her muscles coiling. Daniel swallowed hard. Then, carefully, deliberately, he set the cub down on the ground. The cub wobbled, unsteady on its feet, and let out another faint sound. For a second, the world stood still. Then, the mother moved. One step. Then another. And then she was there, her nose pressing gently into the cub's fur. Daniel watched as she sniffed it, nudging its tiny body with her massive head. The cub, weak but responsive, let out a quiet sound. A recognition. A connection. A mother and her child reunited. Daniel let out a slow, measured breath, feeling the tension in his body begin to fade. But he wasn't safe yet. He took one cautious step back. Then another. The mother grizzly lifted her head, locking eyes with him one last time. For a second, Daniel thought she might charge. But she didn't. She blinked. Then, turning carefully, she nudged her cub, guiding it away from the swamp, back into the safety of the trees. Daniel stood there, frozen, watching them disappear into the wild. And then, they were gone. Silence returned to the clearing. The wind whispered through the trees, rustling the branches. Daniel exhaled, running a shaking hand through his damp hair. It was over. The cub was safe. And for the first time, Daniel realized he had just witnessed something that defied every rule of nature. A mother bear had trusted a human. Not because she had wanted to, but because she had needed to. And that was something he would never, ever forget. This wasn't just a story about survival. It was about trust, instinct, and the unbreakable bond between a mother and her child. Even in the wild, a mother grizzly bear made an impossible choice. She didn't attack. She didn't run. She let a human save her cub. Because in that moment, she knew she had no other option. What would you have done in Daniel's place? Would you have risked everything to save a wild animal? Let us know in the comments below. If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like this video, and turn on notifications so we can continue bringing you powerful real-life stories of courage, survival, and the unbreakable spirit of nature. And most importantly, share this with someone who loves wildlife and inspiring stories. Because sometimes, the wild teaches us lessons we never expected to learn.